If you've ever poured your soul into something, I mean truly given every waking moment, every ounce of your intellect to a project, only to have it stolen from you in the final hour, then you need to hear this. It's a story about being erased, and why you should never, ever underestimate the person you tried to bury. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt that sting of being made invisible, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. It helps more than you know to feel like you're not just speaking into an empty room. My name is Maya, and for 730 days, I was the lead researcher, the architect, and the engine behind the Cellular Regeneration Project in Dr. Alden Finch's world-renowned genetics lab. We weren't just doing research, we were on the precipice of rewriting a fundamental law of biology. We were building a key to unlock the body's own dormant ability to heal itself on a level that was once pure science fiction. It was the kind of work that wins Nobel Prizes, the kind of work that changes the world. And it was my work, my design, my discovery. The air in the lab always had a specific scent, a sterile, cold cocktail of ozone from the mass spectrometers, the faint, almost sweet smell of nutrient agar, and the bitter tang of burnt coffee from the perpetually stained pot in the break room. That smell was the smell of my life. I'd spent more time in that hermetically sealed, white-walled world than I had in my own apartment. My world was a symphony of quiet, rhythmic beeps from the sequencers, the gentle hum of the cryogenic freezers, and the soft tapping of my own fingers on the keyboard, coaxing secrets from the raw data streams. Dr. Alden Finch was the name on the door. He was a titan in the field of genomics, but his reputation was a carefully constructed edifice built on the foundations of other people's work. He was a master of acquiring funding, of charming symposium boards, of speaking in grand, sweeping statements that reporters loved to quote. He was the conductor of the orchestra, but he couldn't play a single instrument. He hadn't run a real experiment himself in at least a decade. His genius wasn't in science. It was in identifying talent, extracting its value, and then presenting it as his own. I knew this, on some level. We all did, but we told ourselves it was the price of admission. To work with his resources, under his prestigious banner, we tolerated his intellectual vampirism. We thought it was a necessary evil. The project, which we called Prometheus, was my brainchild from the very beginning. I had developed the initial hypothesis on a Sunday afternoon, sketching out protein-folding pathways on a stained coffee shop napkin. It was a radical idea that we could use a targeted retrovirus, not to insert new DNA, but to reactivate latent regenerative markers that were switched off after embryonic development. It was risky, and it bucked against 2 decades of established dogma. When I first proposed it to Finch, he'd almost laughed me out of his office. He called it elegant, but impractical, a fool's errand. But I was persistent. I worked on my own time, running simulations on my home computer, using discretionary lab funds for small proof-of-concept tests. And slowly, agonizingly, the data started to prove me right. The first time a cluster of senescent mouse cells began to show signs of reversed aging, I felt a jolt like lightning. It was real. It was possible. Suddenly, Finch was very interested. The fool's errand became his visionary project. My name was still on the internal documents, and I was designated the lead researcher, but in every meeting with the university board, or potential pharmaceutical partners, he spoke of it in the first person. I watched him use my slides, my graphs, my carefully worded explanations, and say, I theorized, I discovered, my team confirmed. I swallowed the bitter pill each time, telling myself it didn't matter who was in the spotlight, as long as the work got done. The science was what mattered. The breakthrough was what mattered. That's the lie we tell ourselves when we're being hollowed out. For 2 years, I lived in the data. I knew its every peak and every trough, every elegant curve and every confounding outlier. The work was my life, and I was on the verge of the finish line. The paper was written, we had a complete, verifiable, and revolutionary data set. It was ready for submission to Nature Genetics, the pinnacle of scientific journals. Our submission date was a Friday. The World Genomics Symposium in Geneva was 6 weeks away, and Finch had already secured the keynote address, contingent on our paper's acceptance. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. The Monday before the submission, he called me into his office. It was a rare occurrence. He usually communicated through his assistants. His office was a stark contrast to the functional chaos of the lab. It was all dark mahogany, leather-bound books he'd never read, and framed awards for work I knew his predecessors had done. He was smiling that wide, empty smile of his, the one that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Maya," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "we're on the 1-yard line. This is the moment." I felt a cautious flicker of pride. I nodded, waiting for the congratulations, for the acknowledgement of the sleepless nights, the weekends I'd sacrificed. He slid a single sheet of paper across the vast desk. It was the cover page of the final manuscript. I looked at it. My eyes scanned the author list. Finch's name was first, of course. That was expected. Then came the names of 2 postdocs, Mark and Alan, who had primarily been responsible for washing beakers and running pre-programmed diagnostics. They were Finch's boys, sycophants, who laughed at his jokes and fetched his coffee. My name wasn't there. It wasn't second. It wasn't third. It wasn't in the acknowledgments. It was gone, vanished, as if I had never existed. I stared at the page, and the hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to grow into a deafening roar. The words on the paper blurred. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I looked up at him, my throat suddenly tight. "There's been a mistake," I managed to say. My voice was a thin, reedy thing I didn't recognize. "No mistake, Maya," he said, his smile tightening just a fraction. "We've had to make some tough decisions about the author list. Mark and Alan have been instrumental in the final validation stages. The board feels their contributions better reflect the lab's collaborative spirit." The board? The board was him. The collaborative spirit? I had single-handedly dragged this project from theory to reality. Mark and Alan couldn't even explain the core methodology without looking at my notes. He wasn't finished, and in light of the project's completion, your role will be shifting. We have a significant backlog of cryo samples that need to be cataloged and archived. It's vital work, detail-oriented, perfect for you. Cataloging samples. It was the lab equivalent of being sent to the mailroom. It was a deliberate, public, and brutal demotion, from lead researcher of the most important project in the lab's history to a glorified clerk. He wasn't just stealing my work, he was burying me alive. He was erasing me from my own life's work and then handing me a shovel to dig my own grave. I looked at him, sitting there behind his fortress of a desk, radiating smug satisfaction. He expected me to cry, to yell, to plead. He was waiting for a messy, emotional outburst that he could use to justify his decision to his colleagues, to paint me as unstable, difficult. I did none of those things. A strange, cold calm washed over me. It was the kind of calm that comes after the lightning strike, when the air is still and charged with ozone. I looked at the paper, then back at him. "I understand," I said. My voice was level. It was steady. It was a voice he had never heard from me before. He seemed almost disappointed by my composure. "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair, the picture of magnanimity. "I knew you'd be a team player. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a call with the symposium organizers. Big things are happening." I stood up, turned, and walked out of his office. I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly behind me. As I walked through the lab, past the humming sequencers that held my data, past Mark and Alan, who were laughing by the coffee machine, past the sympathetic, pitying glances of my junior colleagues, I felt nothing, not sadness, not anger, just a profound, chilling clarity. He thought he had won. He thought it was over. He didn't know that I had seen this coming. He didn't know that his greed was as predictable as a planetary orbit. And he certainly didn't know that over a year ago, I had embedded a benign, beautiful, and utterly lethal anomaly into the heart of the original data set, a digital watermark, a single elegant string of code that was my signature, woven into the very fabric of the discovery, a time bomb that only I knew how to detonate. I let him have the paper. I let him submit it. I let him bask in the initial praise from the pre-publication reviews. And I let him prepare for his keynote address in Geneva, the speech he believed would immortalize him. I went to my new station in the sub-basement, surrounded by thousands of frozen, forgotten samples, and I began to do my work, cataloging, and waiting. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself that over and over. It was about the truth. The truth has a way of being quiet, until it isn't. The silence in my apartment that night was a physical weight. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a home, it was the dead air of a tomb. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my work clothes, the faint smell of the lab clinging to me like a ghost. I didn't turn on the lights. The city glowed through the window, a sprawling nebula of orange and white, and it all felt a million miles away. For the first time in 2 years, I had nothing to do, no data to analyze, no simulations to run, no hypotheses to test. The engine that had driven my entire existence had been shut down, and the stillness was terrifying. That's when the dam broke. It wasn't a loud, screaming breakdown. It was a quiet, internal collapse. A single tear traced a path through the grime of the day on my cheek, then another and another. It was a release of a pressure that had been building for years. The exhaustion I had been holding at bay with caffeine and adrenaline flooded my system, and my bones felt like lead. I curled up on my side, pulling a pillow over my head to block out the world, and I finally let myself feel the full crushing weight of the betrayal. It wasn't just the theft of my name from a paper, it was the erasure of my identity. Finch hadn't just taken credit, he had declared that my contribution, my very existence in that project, was worthless. My mind, no longer occupied with protein chains and statistical models, began to churn, replaying a highlight reel of my own naivete. It was a slideshow of 1,000 tiny cuts that I had ignored. I saw myself a year and a half ago, in a lab meeting. I was presenting a preliminary model for the viral delivery vector. It was the core of the whole project. Finch interrupted me mid-sentence. "That's a good start, Maya," he'd said, turning to the rest of the team. "But what if we refined it like this?" He then proceeded to re-explain my own concept, using slightly different words, and concluded by saying, "Let's proceed with my approach." I remember the flicker of confusion, the feeling of being gaslighted in real time. But I said nothing. I told myself he was just trying to put his own stamp on it for the higher-ups. It was politics. I was a scientist, not a politician. I just wanted to do the work. Then another memory surfaced, sharper this time. About 8 months ago, we'd hit a major roadblock. The reactivated cells were becoming unstable after 72 hours, decaying into cancerous growths. The project was on the verge of collapse. Finch was panicking. The funding was at risk. He'd stormed into the lab, demanding answers I didn't have. I spent the next 3 weeks sleeping in the lab, surviving on vending machine snacks and stale coffee. I built a new statistical analysis model from scratch, one that could parse trillions of data points to find the subtle trigger for the instability. I found it in the mitochondrial response, a detail everyone else had missed. It was the key. The solution was an elegant, simple adjustment to the nutrient medium. It saved the entire project. When I presented the solution to Finch, he didn't even look up from his emails. He just said, "Good, get it done." The next day, in his weekly report to the university chancellor, he wrote, "After a significant setback, I personally reanalyzed the mitochondrial cascade and developed a novel nutrient solution that has put the project back on track." I saw the email because his assistant, a young woman who looked perpetually terrified, had accidentally copied me on the thread. When she realized her mistake, she sent a frantic follow-up, begging me not to say anything. I saw the fear in her eyes, and I promised I wouldn't. I told myself it was for the good of the team, to maintain stability. Another lie. It was weakness. It was my misplaced loyalty to an institution that had none for me. This was his pattern. He was a magpie, building a nest of glittering achievements out of shiny things he'd stolen from others. And my work was the Hope Diamond. My thoughts then drifted to Benjamin Carter, a brilliant kid, a first-year graduate student assigned to our lab. He had a restless, ravenous intellect that reminded me of myself at his age. He was quiet, a little awkward, and he saw things other people missed. Finch and his cronies, Mark and Alan, treated him like an errand boy. They saw his quietness as a lack of confidence, his thoughtful questions as a sign of slowness. They'd send him on pointless errands, make him rerun failed experiments they'd messed up, and generally use him to absorb their own frustrations. I'd taken him under my wing. I saw the spark in him. I'd stay late and walk him through the complex theoretical models. He'd ask probing, insightful questions that often helped me see my own work from a new angle. One evening, as we were troubleshooting a faulty sequencer, he'd looked at me with a kind of raw sincerity and said, "You know, Dr. Maya, I came to this university to work with Dr. Finch. I've read all his papers, but you're the one who's actually teaching me everything. You're the one doing the real work." The comment had warmed me, but it had also sent a chill down my spine. The truth was obvious, even to a first-year student. How could I have been so blind to the fact that a truth so clear would eventually become a threat? My competence wasn't an asset to Finch, it was a liability. It was a ticking clock, counting down to the day when everyone else would realize who was the real brains of the operation. His betrayal wasn't just greed, it was self-preservation. Lying there in the dark, the sting of his dismissal began to morph into something else. The self-pity began to curdle, hardening into a cold, dense fury. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was a quiet, glacial rage. The rage of the architect who sees her cathedral being claimed by the man who only laid the ceremonial first stone. It wasn't about revenge. I whispered it into the pillow. The phrase felt like a shield. If it was about revenge, it would be emotional, messy, and beneath me. But if it was about truth, if it was about justice, then it was a moral imperative. It was a duty. And that's when the catalyst arrived. My phone, lying face down on the nightstand, buzzed. The screen cast a pale, ghostly light in the dark room. I almost ignored it. I wanted to be left alone in my misery, but something made me reach for it. It was an email from Ben. The subject line read, "Small idea recascade stabilization." My finger trembled as I opened it. He wrote, "Dr. Maya, I know it's late. I'm sorry to bother you. I wasn't able to find you in the lab today. I was thinking about the mitochondrial instability problem from a few months back. I know you solved it, but I was running some simulations based on that model you taught me, and I think I found a secondary pathway that could increase post-regeneration stability by another 48 hours. It's probably nothing, but I attached my data. Hope you're having a good evening." He didn't know. He had no idea that I had been cast out, that my name was gone, that my work had been stolen. He was still in the lab, inspired by my teaching, building on my foundation, and trying to make the work better, and he was sharing it with me, the person he trusted, the person he saw as the source. Reading his email was like a defibrillator shock to my soul. The despair vanished, incinerated by a sudden white-hot clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about him. It was about every brilliant young scientist who would be chewed up and spat out by men like Finch. It was about the integrity of the scientific process itself, which Finch was turning into a grotesque pantomime. If he could erase me, he could erase anyone. If his lies became the official record, then the truth itself ceased to matter. I sat up. The tears were gone. My heartbeat was slow and steady. The cold, dense rage had found a purpose. It was no longer a weight, but a fuel. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. The woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was not a clerk to be relegated to a basement. She was the architect, and architects know every weakness in the foundation of the buildings they design. I stood up and walked over to my desk, the one piled high with textbooks and printouts of genomic code. I switched on the lamp, and the warm light felt like a sunrise. I wasn't going to fight him for credit. I wasn't going to file a complaint with the university's toothless ethics committee. That was his game. Played on his field, by his rules. I was going to play a different game entirely. It was time to make a call. The memory of Ben's email, his innocent and brilliant contribution, had solidified my resolve. But the plan itself had been born from an earlier, colder realization. It began almost a year before my dismissal. Not with a bang, but with a quiet observation. I was in the lab's server room, a place I rarely needed to go, to retrieve an old data archive. The room was kept at a steady, frigid temperature, the air humming with the sound of dozens of cooling fans. I saw Finch in there with Mark, one of his two pet postdocs. They were standing in front of the main data repository for a now completed project, one that had belonged to a talented but soft-spoken researcher named Dr. Evelyn Reed, who had conveniently decided to pursue other opportunities right after the paper was published with her name buried in the acknowledgments. Mark was holding a portable hard drive. Finch was directing him. Just copy the final dataset, he'd said, his voice low but sharp, and the presentation slides, not the raw data logs, not the experimental variants, just the clean, final version. We don't need the clutter. The phrase stuck with me. We don't need the clutter. The clutter was the real work. It was the messy, iterative, failure-ridden process of discovery. It was the 99 wrong turns you take to find the one right path. Finch didn't care about the journey. He only wanted the pristine, marketable destination. He didn't understand the data. He only understood the headline it would generate. He was a tourist taking a picture of a mountain, with no concept of the tectonic forces that created it. In that moment, I understood his core vulnerability. His arrogance was rooted in his intellectual laziness. He trusted that the final product was the only thing of value, and he outsourced his understanding of it to others. He would never ever dig into the raw data himself. It was beneath him, and in that weakness, I saw an opportunity, not to sabotage the work. I could never do that. My respect for the science was absolute, but I could sign my name to it, in a way that only a true scientist, a true creator, would ever be able to see. So I began my own project, in secret. It was a project of foresight. It took me 3 months of late nights, working on a personal, air-gapped laptop I kept in a locked drawer in my apartment. I started building what I called the anomaly. It wasn't a virus or a piece of malware. That would be crude, a violation of the data's integrity. No, this was something far more elegant. I designed a benign recursive sequence, a short synthetic strand of genetic data that could be embedded within the massive datasets of the Prometheus project. To a superficial analysis, it would look like statistical noise, a tiny, insignificant outlier that would be dismissed by any standard diagnostic software. Finch's team, I knew, would only ever run the standard diagnostics. They were as lazy as he was arrogant, but this noise was anything but random. The sequence was designed to be self-referential. When analyzed with the right algorithm, my algorithm, it didn't behave like noise at all. It resolved into a clear, repeating pattern, a fractal based on a specific prime number, a number I had chosen from my own childhood, a small personal secret. It was a digital watermark, woven into the very DNA of the data. It was a signature, invisible to the layman, but screamingly obvious to an expert who knew what to look for. It was my name, written in the language of life itself. I created a two-tiered data system. The first tier was the official lab server, where I would upload the day's progress, but every night, I would download the raw data to an encrypted drive, take it home, and run it through my private server. There I would painstakingly embed the anomaly into the new data clusters, ensuring it was seamlessly integrated, a ghost in the machine. Then the next morning, I would replace the data on the lab server with my modified watermarked version. It was a meticulous, nerve-wracking process. A single mistake could have corrupted the entire project, but I was careful, I was precise, I was the architect, and I was building a hidden room inside my own cathedral. This secret work became my grim comfort. It was a shield against the growing certainty that Finch would eventually betray me. I knew I couldn't trust him to be honorable, but I could absolutely trust him to be greedy. His character was a constant I could build my calculations around. Alongside this technical preparation, I cultivated my allies, not in a manipulative way, but by simply being a good colleague, a good mentor. My relationship with Ben was the most important. I invested in him, sharing my knowledge freely, because I believed in his potential. I was building a bond of genuine loyalty, a currency Finch knew nothing about. He only dealt in fear and ambition. I dealt in mutual respect. I knew that when the time came, Ben's perception of the truth would be invaluable. He was my witness, even if he didn't know what he was witnessing yet. The other key ally was external, a person who represented the world outside our toxic little bubble. Dr. Eris Thorne. He was the head of genetics at a rival university in Boston, a brilliant and notoriously blunt man who had been Finch's academic rival for years. Thorne was a pure scientist, a man who still got his hands dirty in the lab. He and I had served on a minor review panel together a few years prior, and we'd struck up a conversation about signal processing in genomic data. He was impressed with my insights. A few months before my dismissal, feeling the walls closing in, I had sent Dr. Thorne a carefully worded email under the guise of asking for his opinion on a tangential problem. In the email, I embedded a very small, very clean sample of my Prometheus data, a sample that did not contain my anomaly. I wanted his unvarnished expert opinion on the work itself. His reply came 2 days later. It was short and to the point. Maya, this is groundbreaking. The methodology for stabilizing the protein cascade is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's a work of genius. Finch is lucky to have you. If he ever stops appreciating what you are, my door is always open. That email was my parachute. I printed it out and kept it in a folder at home with my birth certificate and passport. It was external validation from a source no one could question. It was proof that my contribution was not just real but revolutionary. It was the ace I held in my hand. So when Finch called me into his office and delivered his sterile, condescending execution, I was not a woman falling from a great height. I was a woman stepping out of a door, knowing my parachute was securely strapped to my back. My calmness in his office wasn't just an act, it was the result of long and careful preparation. I had anticipated his greed, and I had built a response to it brick by meticulous brick. After the initial shock wore off in my apartment that night, after Ben's email had reignited my purpose, I moved from planning to action. The first thing I did was reply to Ben. Ben, thank you for this, I wrote. This is brilliant. Truly, you have a remarkable mind. Hold on to this data. Don't share it with anyone else for now. Let's keep it between us. There are some changes happening in the lab, and I think it's best if we are careful. I am fine, just working on a different project for a while. Let's talk soon. It was a message of encouragement, but also a quiet warning. I was telling him to trust me, to be patient, and to protect his own work. I was drawing a line in the sand. The next phase of my plan was the most difficult. It required patience and a willingness to endure humiliation. I had to let Finch have his victory. I had to let him believe he had utterly and completely won. So the next day, I reported to my new post in the sub-basement. The cryo archive was a cold, lonely place. It was a vast windowless room, filled with rows upon rows of massive humming liquid nitrogen freezers. My job was to take thousands of tiny frozen vials of tissue samples, remnants of forgotten experiments from the last 30 years, and update their location in a clunky, outdated database. It was mind-numbing, isolating work designed to break a person's spirit. Mark and Alan would sometimes come down to retrieve an old sample, and they would smirk at me, the fallen queen, now exiled to the dungeons. They'd make sure to talk loudly about Geneva, about the parties, about how Finch was rewriting his keynote speech to make it more impactful. I let their taunts wash over me. I nodded politely. I found the samples they needed. I was a model employee. Inside, I was a coiled spring. I used the isolation to my advantage. With no one watching, I had unlimited access to the university's internal network from my forgotten terminal. I could track the progress of the paper, the symposium schedule, everything. I was a ghost in the machine, watching the man who had ghosted me. The submission of the paper to Nature Genetics went exactly as I expected. It was accepted with minor revisions in record time. The breakthrough was too significant to ignore. The peer reviewers, as I predicted, flagged the statistical noise in Cluster 7b. I saw the query in the system logs. One reviewer wrote, "There is a statistically anomalous recursive signal in this cluster. It does not appear to impact the conclusion, but it is unexplained. Can the authors clarify its origin?" I watched the email thread between Finch, Mark, and Alan. Their response was a masterpiece of arrogant dismissal. Mark wrote, "It's probably just a ghost artifact from the new sequencers. I'll write a line in the methods section about potential signal contamination." Finch replied with a single word, "Good." They hadn't looked. They hadn't even bothered to run a deep analysis. They saw a tiny speck of dust on their masterpiece and simply brushed it off, too lazy and self-important to consider it might be something more. They had just casually, thoughtlessly confirmed the existence of my anomaly in their official response to the journal. They had authenticated my signature for me. I saved a copy of that entire email exchange to my encrypted drive. It was another piece of evidence, another brick in the foundation of my case. The day Finch's keynote address was officially announced was the day I made my next move. I went online and bought a standard admission ticket to the World Genomics Symposium in Geneva. I booked my own flight. I reserved a room in a modest hotel, a few blocks from the massive convention center. I was going to be in the audience. I was going to watch him deliver the speech of his life, a speech built entirely on my work, on my data, on my discovery. It wasn't about revenge. I told myself this as I typed in my credit card number. It was about accountability. It was about being in the room where it happened. My silent takeover was a campaign of inaction. My primary weapon was patience. I let the system work. I let Finch build his own stage, his own platform, his own pedestal. The higher he climbed, the more spectacular his fall would be. The weeks leading up to the symposium were a strange kind of purgatory. I went to my menial job in the basement every day. I cataloged the frozen tears of 100 other forgotten projects. I listened to the hum of the freezers, and I waited. On the surface, I was a ghost, a non-entity. But beneath the surface, I was preparing for war. My evenings were spent not in despair, but in meticulous preparation. I wasn't building a counter-presentation. I wasn't assembling a dossier of evidence to leak to a reporter. That would be messy. It would create a scandal, but it would also center Finch. It would be a he said, she said debate that would drag on for months, and he was better at that game than I was. My plan was cleaner, more surgical. It was to use the purity of science as the weapon. I fine-tuned the one thing I needed, the question. It had to be perfect. It couldn't sound accusatory. It couldn't be emotional. It had to be a genuine scientific inquiry, posed with professional curiosity. It had to be a question that any legitimate lead researcher on the project should be able to answer instantly. And it had to be a question that I knew, with absolute certainty, that Alden Finch could not answer. It had to be a key that would turn a lock he didn't even know existed. I rehearsed it in my apartment, speaking to an empty room. I wrote it on a notepad, refining every word. I stripped it of any hint of animosity, polishing it until it was a smooth, sharp, and deadly instrument. Meanwhile, the first tremors of his downfall were beginning, so subtle that only I could feel them. Ben, my loyal source inside the lab, would send me discreet updates. He told me that a major pharmaceutical company, one that had been courting Finch for the rights to the Prometheus technology, had sent their top scientist for a due diligence meeting. The scientist, a sharp woman named Dr. Irina Volkov, had asked some deeply technical questions about the raw data outputs. Mark and Alan, who Finch had sent to handle the meeting, had fumbled. They couldn't answer her questions with the depth she expected. Ben overheard Volkov on the phone in the hallway later. Her voice was low and clipped. "They're unprepared," she'd said. "It's like they're reading from a script. The lead on this, a Dr. Maya Rao, seems to have been reassigned. I want to know why. Something isn't right." Finch, in his arrogance, dismissed the feedback. He believed the prestige of the upcoming symposium and the Nature Genetics publication would be enough to close the deal. He didn't realize that serious people, people with real money on the line, care about the clutter. They care about the details. They can smell a fraud. The day before I was due to fly to Geneva, I did one last thing. I sent a short encrypted email to Dr. Eris Thorne in Boston. "Dr. Thorne, I hope you are well. I value your opinion greatly. If you have a moment during the symposium, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on the raw data presented in Cluster 7B of Finch's keynote. I believe you might find it interesting. Sincerely, Maya Rao." I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. I knew his intellectual curiosity was boundless. I was planting a seed. I was inviting another expert to look closely at the exact spot where I had hidden my signature. My flight to Geneva was surreal. I was surrounded by chattering scientists, all buzzing with excitement for the symposium. They were all talking about Finch's upcoming keynote. They called it the Finch Breakthrough. They spoke his name with reverence. I sat by the window, watching the clouds drift by, feeling like a spy behind enemy lines. I felt a profound sense of calm. The plan was in motion. The pieces were on the board. All I had to do was make my final move. The day of the keynote, The main hall of the Geneva Convention Center was electric. It was a vast, tiered amphitheater, packed with over 2,000 of the world's leading geneticists, researchers, pharmaceutical executives, and science journalists. It was the Super Bowl of my field, and Alden Finch was the halftime show. I found a seat in the middle of the auditorium, not too close to the front, not too far back, just another face in the crowd. I wore a simple professional gray dress. I wanted to look forgettable, invisible. I watched as Finch's sycophants, Mark and Alan, bustled around backstage, looking self-important. I saw Dr. Thorne find a seat a few rows ahead of me, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read the program. The lights dimmed. The moderator, a distinguished Swiss biologist, walked onto the stage. His introduction of Finch was glowing, filled with superlatives. A visionary, a pioneer, a man who is about to change the very definition of what is possible. Finch walked out onto the stage to a thunderous wave of applause. He soaked it in, spreading his arms wide, a benevolent king accepting the adoration of his subjects. He looked tanned, rested, and supremely confident. He launched into his presentation. It was slick. The slides, my slides, were beautiful. The graphics, my graphics, were compelling. He was a masterful performer, his voice resonating with passion and authority. He told the story of the project, a story I knew intimately, but he told it with himself as the sole protagonist. He spoke of his initial hypothesis, his struggle through setbacks, his moment of brilliant insight. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing even. I felt my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. He moved to the core of the presentation, the data, my beautiful data, displayed on a 50-foot screen behind him. He pointed to the elegant curves, the proof of cellular regeneration, the successful stabilization. The audience was captivated. There were audible gasps. People were leaning forward in their seats, scribbling notes. This was it, the moment he had been dreaming of. I saw Dr. Thorne, in the rows ahead of me, lean closer to his tablet, his finger tracing something on the screen. He had taken the bait. He was looking. Finch reached his crescendo, the triumphant conclusion. This, he declared, his voice booming through the hall, is not the end of a project. It is the beginning of a new era, an era of healing, an era of Prometheus, unbound. The applause was deafening, a standing ovation. He stood there, basking in it, a wide, triumphant smile plastered on his face. He had done it. He had pulled it off. He had successfully stolen a Nobel-worthy discovery in front of the entire world. The moderator stepped back to the podium, letting the applause die down. Thank you, Dr. Finch, for a truly historic presentation. We have time for a few questions from the audience. Microphones were set up in the aisles. A few people lined up immediately, eager to ask about clinical applications, about commercialization, about the future. I didn't move. I let them ask their fawning, predictable questions. Finch answered them with practiced ease, his confidence swelling with every response. Then, there was a lull. The moderator scanned the room. Any final questions? Slowly, deliberately, I stood up. A spotlight operator, seeing my movement, swung a beam of light onto me. Suddenly, I was no longer an anonymous face in the crowd. I was illuminated. I saw Finch squint, trying to see who it was. I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, then a flash of irritation. What was she doing here? I walked calmly to the nearest microphone. The hall was silent. My footsteps echoed softly. I could feel 2,000 pairs of eyes on me. I took a deep breath. Dr. Maya Rao, I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the massive hall. I didn't add my affiliation. I didn't need to. Dr. Finch, a fascinating presentation, truly remarkable work. I let the compliment hang in the air. I saw him relax slightly, a smug little nod. He thought I was here to congratulate him, to be a good sport. I have a simple question about the data, I continued, my tone one of pure academic curiosity. Could you elaborate on the persistent recursive signal sequence found in data cluster 7b, the one that doesn't map to any known cellular decay artifact or sequencing error, but seems to resolve, with startling precision, to a prime number-based fractal. It appears to be a structural anomaly, but it's so mathematically perfect that it seems statistically impossible to be random noise. I was just wondering if you could explain its origin and purpose in the dataset. Silence. A deep, profound, and absolute silence fell over the entire auditorium. I had delivered the question. The key was in the lock. Alden Finch froze. His smile didn't just disappear, it seemed to shatter, leaving a slack-jawed, hollow expression in its place. The confident, triumphant king on the stage vanished, replaced by a man in a very expensive suit who had just been asked to explain the mechanics of a fusion reactor in ancient Greek. His eyes darted around, unseeing. The blood drained from his face, leaving his expensive tan looking like a cheap, sallow mask. Cluster 7b, a recursive sequence, a prime number fractal. The words meant nothing to him. They were sounds from a language he didn't speak. It was the clutter he had told Mark to ignore. It was the detail he had been too arrogant and too lazy to ever investigate. It was the foundation of the cathedral, and he didn't even know it was there. I could see the frantic calculations behind his eyes. He was trying to bluff his way out. "Ah yes," he began, his voice suddenly a full octave higher than it had been moments before. He cleared his throat. "The anomaly in 7b, of course. That's a known artifact of the new generation of deep sequencing technology we employed. A signal echo. It has no bearing on the results." His answer was weak, and everyone in that room knew it. A low murmur started to ripple through the audience. In the front rows, I could see scientists, real scientists, pulling up the publicly available data from the Nature Genetics pre-publication server on their tablets and laptops. They were looking, they were running their own analyses, and then a second voice cut through the silence. It was Dr. Eris Thorne. He stood up, holding his tablet. He wasn't addressing the microphone, but his voice carried in the tense quiet. "It's not an echo, Alden," Thorne said, his tone sharp and clinical. "I'm looking at the raw telemetry right now. This sequence isn't noise. It's structured, it's deliberate, it's almost like a signature." Finch's composure completely crumbled. A sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. He looked from Thorne's stern, accusing face to my calm, unreadable one. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a fish, gasping for air on a dry dock. He had built his entire career on the words of others, and now, when he needed them most, he had none of his own. The moderator, sensing a catastrophe unfolding, tried to intervene. "Perhaps we can take this discussion offline." But it was too late. The dam had broken. The truth was loose in the room, and it was ravenous. Another researcher, a woman from the Max Planck Institute, stood up. "Dr. Thorne is right," she said, her German accent precise. "This is not an artifact. This is embedded data. What is this, Finch?" The murmur in the crowd grew into a roar of conversation. The spell was broken. The illusion was shattered. They weren't looking at a visionary anymore. They were looking at a fraud, exposed in the brightest spotlight of his life. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. My question had not been an accusation. It had been a diagnostic tool, and it had just revealed a fatal disease. I watched Finch for one last moment. He was staring at me, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic and hatred. In that moment, he finally understood. He understood the scope of his miscalculation. He hadn't just fired a subordinate. He had underestimated an architect. Slowly I turned from the microphone and walked back to my seat. I sat down. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, and I watched as Alden Finch's world unraveled, live on stage, in front of every single one of his peers. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The symposium moderator ended the Q&A session abruptly. Finch stumbled off the stage, not to applause, but to a rising tide of shocked and suspicious whispers. The event, which was supposed to be his coronation, had become his public execution. I didn't stay to watch the aftermath. My work was done. I slipped out of the auditorium, walked out of the convention center, into the cool, clean Geneva air, and I never looked back. By the time my plane landed back in the States, The story was already breaking across the scientific community. Nature Genetics issued a statement announcing they were putting the publication of the paper on hold, pending an inquiry into data integrity. The university, forced into a corner by the public nature of the scandal, announced a formal investigation into allegations of academic misconduct against Dr. Finch. The pharmaceutical company that had been courting him officially withdrew their offer, citing concerns about the project's leadership and data provenance. The beauty of my plan was that I never had to make a single accusation. I never had to show anyone my evidence. The emails, Dr. Thorne's note, my own meticulous logs. I simply asked a single, honest question about the science. The science itself did the rest. The anomaly, my hidden signature, was the proof. It was a question only the true author could ask, and only a fraud could fail to answer. Finch wasn't brought down by a personal vendetta, he was brought down by a fact he had been too arrogant to see. A week later, I received 2 emails. The first was from the university chancellor. It was a stiff, formal request for a meeting. I knew what it would be, a desperate attempt at damage control, probably an offer of my old job back, maybe even Finch's job, a pathetic attempt to put the genie back in the bottle. I deleted it without replying. You can't go back and rebuild on a toxic foundation. You have to build somewhere new. The second email was from Dr. Eris Thorne. Maya, it read, I've just been appointed interim head of the university's new internal review board for the Finch case. I imagine you know what that means, but that's not why I'm writing. I'm writing to say that what I saw in that data, and what I saw in that auditorium, was the most elegant act of intellectual justice I have ever witnessed. My offer still stands, but I think you and I both know you're destined for more than a position in my lab. Let's talk when you're ready. I have some people I think you should meet. 2 months later, Alden Finch was officially stripped of his endowed chair and forced to resign in disgrace. His name, once a titan in the field, was now a cautionary tale whispered at conferences. Mark and Alan, tainted by their association, found their own careers stalled, their names synonymous with academic fraud. They faded into obscurity. I met with Dr. Thorne. He introduced me to a consortium of private investors and philanthropists who were disillusioned with the politics and bureaucracy of university research. They weren't looking for celebrity scientists. They were looking for real science. They had followed the story of the symposium. They understood exactly who I was and what I represented. They gave me a blank check, not to continue the Prometheus project. That work was now tangled in a web of legal and ethical inquiries. They gave me a blank check to build something new, from the ground up, an independent research institute, founded on the principles of transparency, collaboration, and absolute scientific integrity. I named it the Rayo Institute. My name, on the front of the building. My first hire was Benjamin Carter. I offered him the position of lead research associate. When I called him, his voice was thick with emotion. He told me how, after the symposium, he had been the one to show the University Review Board the specific algorithm needed to unlock my anomaly. He had become the keeper of the key I had created. He was no longer a quiet errand boy. He was a truth teller. Today I'm sitting in my office. It's clean, filled with light, and it overlooks a lab full of brilliant young minds, all collaborating, all respected. The smell is of progress, not of burnt coffee and fear. On my wall there is only one framed document. It's not a degree or an award, it's a simple high-resolution printout of the data from Cluster 7b, showing the elegant, undeniable pattern of my watermark, my signature. It was never about revenge. I stand by that even now. Revenge is a fire that consumes you. This was not a fire. It was a construction. It was the demolition of a corrupt structure to make way for a sound one. Finch's greed was a force of nature. I couldn't stop, but I could use its own momentum to bring him down. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a resource to be exploited. And that was his fatal error. He forgot that the person who builds the engine also knows exactly where to place the grain of sand that will make it seize. So, this is my story. It's a story about the quiet power of competence, and the fact that true value can be suppressed, but it can never be truly erased. It will always find a way to the surface. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever had your work stolen, or your voice silenced, know this: your moment of vindication may not be loud. It may not be a dramatic confrontation. It might be a single quiet question that changes everything. Build your skills, document your work, cultivate your allies, and never ever let them make you believe that you are as small as they want you to be. You are the architect of your own life. Make sure you sign your name to the blueprint. Thank you for listening. If this story helped you, or if you see yourself in it, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share it with someone who might need to hear it, and leave a comment below. I read them all. It's important to know that none of us are alone in these fights. We are all architects, and it's time we started building together.